So kind of the rundown of the things we're going to look at: how to create a zone, and how those are defined, typically defined by a formation interval, but we can also base those on depth ranges. How to create an attribute, whether it be one we create from scratch or if it's something calculated from within either Zone Manager itself or from another platform. How to import data into Zone Manager, whether this is, again, something generated outside of the program, whether it be like a spreadsheet or, again, something you're bringing from some other software. And then how that data is generated from within other modules and then pushed into Zone Manager. So again, how that data is being brought into Zone Manager primarily. And then how to incorporate that zone data that you create there within Zone Manager into these other modules. And primarily, we're going to be looking at mapping that data within GeoAtlas, taking those attributes, building maps of those, or posting them on our well-based layers. So not too much else here. We're just going to jump right into the demonstration portion here and kind of run through some of those basics. So we'll switch over into GeoGraphix. So I've got a project set up here I'm going to be working in. Kind of a fairly small area. If anybody's taken our Zone Manager class before, it'll look very similar to that in that particular project set. I want to kind of start first by talking about Zone Manager and what essentially a zone is within this particular platform. So before I kind of jump into that, I'm just going to kind of show you guys here from a cross section I have area that we're going to be kind of primarily focused on here. I've got kind of highlighted in this red. This is my F11 top to my F11 base. This is going to be my zone definition. So we're going in here and we're thinking about this zone. We're basically thinking about any kind of data or any kind of calculations we want to do are going to exist between these two tops. Now, when I do zone calculations, I can do them across multiple zones sometimes. So I'm able to kind of figure out within cross section or anything else, kind of where these zones are going to be based on these formation tops. But again, kind of going back to thinking about a zone, this is how we're thinking of it. Where are these tops picked? And then kind of what data will exist within that particular area. So this is my area, F11 base. Everything I'm going to be working in is going to be contained within here. So just kind of giving you an idea of what that is in reference to there. And then we're going to go back over to Zone Manager and look at creating that zone. So typically, the first thing you'll do whenever you start to build out these zones is to create the zone, so that once we start populating it with data, wherever that data might be coming from, that zone is there ready for us to work with. So I'm going to come here to within Zone Manager, say File, and then New Zone. So I'm going to go ahead and define the zone. Like I said, this is primarily around the F11 formation area. I've already got a zone in this project from other work already called F11 zone. So I'm just going to call this one my F11 primary. If I can spell primary zone. And then we're going to define what the interval is going to be for this particular zone. Now, like I said, primarily these are going to be based on formation top ranges, but I can also base them on measured depth or subsea data depth ranges. So I know I'm just going to be calculating something over a window of, from an absolute measured depth of 5,000 feet down to 7,000 feet. I can set it up that way, but again, primarily I'm looking at formation ranges. So I'm going to say F11 to the F11 base. So that is my zone definition here. If I want to offset any of that, I can say start 10 feet above the F11, go 20 feet below the F11 base, or 100 feet, anything I want to do in there. I can offset this information above or below these particular tops, especially if I want to do like a window about a particular formation. Say I want to do a zone that's just 50 feet above the F11 and 50 feet below. I can do something with that as well. F11, say offset that 50 feet above, 50 feet below. So you can set up zones that way as well. The other important thing to note with your zones is this value here called the calculate XYZ position. That's basically going to determine, in the case of deviated wellbores, where along that within this particular interval do I want this XYZ position to be. That's going to be the point that is going to be used for data points whenever you're gridding or creating contour maps for any of your zone attributes. As well as posting these values along a wellbore for your downhole position data. It's going to be somewhere along that wellbore. Now, in this case, it's either going to be the top base or middle of the interval. So top of the interval means it's going to post it at the F11 top, wherever its intercept is along the wellbore. Base of the interval, it's going to put it at the F11 base pick along that wellbore, wherever that intercept is, or a midway point between the two, middle of the interval. So kind of three different options there for determining that. In the case that I'm working with here, pretty much every well I have in here is a straight hole well. So the XYZ position is going to be the same place, regardless of which one I choose there. It's all straight hole. So whenever I look at posting that value on a map, there's no downhole position along a wellbore to post it. It's all just going to be, along that wellbore. So it won't really matter too much, but just keep in mind that whenever you're looking at those deviated wellbores, where do you want this data point to be? So a lot of times it's either going to be the top of the base of the interval. When you're building out these zones, you can put a little note description in here about the zone. If anybody else working in your project with you stumbles across that zone and isn't quite sure what type of data goes in there, put a little note saying, who created it, what it was created for, what formation area it may kind of pertain to. I'm using this primarily for my petrophysics attributes or anything else like that. Little note in there so that, again, multi-user environment, everybody's kind of aware of what these zones are used for. And then a domain option for setting if it's going to be generic, geological, geophysical, or petrophysical. The domain setup here doesn't really affect anything in the long run, as it won't. If I set this up as petrophysical, it does not mean that I can only put petrophysical data in there. It's primarily going to be used for informational purposes. When you have multiple zones in your project, you can kind of sort zone columns based on which domain it is. Technically, you don't have to set a domain for your zone if you don't want to. But sometimes you can just call it generic if you're just going to be putting a bunch of data in there, or if you're mostly just going to be putting petrophysical data in there, you can kind of flag it as one or the other there. So for what I'm doing here, this is the F11 primary zone from the F11 to the F11 base. My XYZ position is calculated at the top, and then I'll go ahead and click OK. There's no limit to the number of zones you can put into your project. Each zone, like I said, kind of in a multi-user environment, each user can have their zone. But primarily, you want to think of a zone as defined as from one formation range to another. If there's already been a zone set up for a particular formation range, you don't necessarily need to have each one for each user. But depending on the type of data that's going to be going into there, and if you don't necessarily want it to balloon with a lot of different attributes within there, it could be beneficial for each user to kind of have their own zone over a specific interval. So I've got the zone created and defined here. Let's just kind of go ahead and look at what kind of data we've gotten here right now. I haven't really imported anything or brought anything over into it, so there's not really going to be much, but there's some basic information about the zone that I may want to look at. So from here, F11 primary zone, I'm going to come over to the right and say Open Spreadsheet. So the spreadsheet in this case is going to be, these are all the various attributes that I want to look at in a spreadsheet view within Zone Manager. So let's just say all attributes, everything I've gotten in here so far, and we'll just see what we have. Okay, so spreadsheet view is going to open, and it's going to show me kind of some of the basic information about these wells within the zone right now. This is what we call the XYZ data. So this information is what's going to be used for mapping purposes, posting these values on a map, using them as data points for gridding and contouring. So this information, one of the first things you'll need to do whenever you first create your zone is calculate and fill in this information with XYZ data. If I don't have XYZ data calculated, then I'm not going to be able to post any of these values for any of my attributes, or I'm not going to be able to create maps on them until this data is calculated. So I usually try to get that done pretty early on. To calculate that data, you'll just say Tools, Calculate Zone XYZ Data. So that goes through. It's going to check my F11 and F11 base picks and all the wells, and then give me information here along here, depending on where I said that the XYZ data would be calculated along that well bore. So I'll see things here for my X, my Y, MD, top MD, base MD, TVD, and TVD sub C. That's all the information about the F11 pick in these wells and the F11 base pick. I'll see a couple of these don't have an F11 base pick, where they're blank here. So that means I need to go find these wells and make a pick in there, or they just don't have a particular base pick. And in certain calculations, there's no F11 base, then it either goes down to the next available top or the TD of the well, whichever one it comes across first. And we'll point some of those places out as we go through there. So it gives me an idea of how the zone's been defined, how the data looks. So right now I'm not really going to see much beyond just zone definition information. Okay, so that's my zone definition. We primarily focused on, I'm looking at this top to this top, this area to this area, and just kind of focusing on those within that particular well. So you kind of create as many zones there, covering as many different areas as you need. And when you get into these other applications, then I can now use this F11 primary zone for petrophysical calculations, interval picking, anything else that I kind of need to there. So once I've got that zone defined, I want to go ahead and look at now populating this with some attributes. So typically these attributes, they can be created ahead of time. So I can create an attribute, have it ready there. So when I start importing data, I can choose them. Or we'll kind of see as I go through here, when I import data, I can create these attributes directly from there as well. So they don't have to be set up ahead of time. They can. I want to create an attribute. Simply just come up here to edit project attributes. And I can see all the various attributes that I may have already created within this particular project. A number of these I've created from another zone at one time. And if I want to create new attributes, then I'll just say edit or add down here at the bottom. And then I can create these new attribute names. So some of these things I'm going to be bringing in here in just a minute. One of them is something I've just put in here called a flag. In this case, it's just going to be a, B, C, or D. This, just a generic flag value that I want to put on the well to indicate, what type of well it might be, and then I can use that value for posting purposes. It's nothing really associated with it. But I just need to give it a name, so I'm going to call this just a flag. What its units are, if it's in feet, barrels, millimeters, milliseconds, meters, whatever it might be in. In this case, it's just a generic flag value. So I don't necessarily need to associate any units with it. And then any kind of domain, again, generic, geological, geophysical, petrophysical. Like I said, doesn't provide any limits on the amount of data or what type of data you can work on within there. Just all going to be practical or sorting purposes kind of thing. Other thing to note is the data types. I kind of talked about units there a little bit. That's not really going to affect me here because this is going to be a text attribute. Like I said, it's mainly just going to be an A, B, C, or D that I can then use for thematic mapping, so I can color code my wells based on what type of flag value it might have. So there's 3 different types: numeric, text, and date. Just be aware that once you've created the attribute, you've given it its name and its type. That cannot be changed once that is once I've created that attribute. I can come in here and edit other things like units or domain, but I cannot edit type or attribute name. So once I've got that set up, I'll go ahead and click OK. And I can see in here now, there is the flag attribute. You can see the data type is set to string. And if I click on edit, I'll see data type is grayed out and name is grayed out. So those 2 things can't be changed once the attribute is created. So be kind of careful when you're going through there and creating those. Okay. So I can create as many attributes as I want to from here. Like I said, I can also create them as I'm importing data in or transferring data in from other platforms. First one I'm going to look at is just importing in a spreadsheet of some attribute values. So we'll look at how we can create some more attributes from that. So for right now, I'm going to click OK out of here. So that attribute has been created, that is stored in my project, but I have not associated that attribute to my zone yet. I'll see it didn't appear over here in my list of particular attributes. So before, until I bring in some data for that attribute and say that it's going to this zone, that attribute is just kind of existing in space right now. And I can associate that attribute to multiple zones. So I didn't necessarily call it the F11 flag or something like that, because I can then use the flag for, okay, in the F11 zone, it might have one value. In a different zone, it might have a different value. And so when you're looking at your various attribute names, sometimes you want to keep them fairly generic as they can be applied to multiple different zones. And then within each zone, it has a different value associated to it. So we'll first look at importing in some data. So I'm going to say file import and ASCII import. So browse out for the file. Any spreadsheets that you want to import into Zone Manager need to be saved out as a CSV, comma delimited file. So on my desktop here, I have this zone webinar file. And so it's going to pull the data in, and now I just need to highlight first row of data there to indicate, okay, I got 3 attributes in here that I'm kind of creating. Where are these going to go? And so I have an EUR, a flag, and a date attribute with this. And with anything else that you import, like pretty much anything within GeoGraphix there, you have to have some sort of well ID identifier for that data so it knows where to put these values. So I'll need to go ahead and associate well ID in this column here called attribute. This is going to be where I have all the various attributes that I've created for my project. So I'll come in here and say well ID, goes to well ID. And then after that, I'm going to look for everything else. So flag we created, so I'll associate flag to that. And if I look in here for EUR and the date that I've got here, I don't see any attributes for that. So let's go ahead and create one. I'm going to say a new attribute. This is going to be my EUR. And I'm going to set this equal to barrels. And again, I can assign a domain to this if I want. I don't necessarily need to. But this type is going to be numeric. It's going to be a numeric attribute. And I'm going to round this off to the nearest whole number, 0 decimals. Data that I have is primarily all just going to be a bunch of whole numbers in here. So I've got that information filled out. Go ahead and click OK. So now I should be able to come in here to the drop-down box, and there is my EUR. So we'll do one more for the date, same new attribute. And I'm just going to call this date. Again, in this case, units aren't really going to matter because the data type for this is date. So remember, there's those 3 data types that we have here, numeric, text, and date. So I've got that selected there. I don't need units or domain for that. And then go ahead and click OK. And then we'll associate that. So now I've got all of these mapped out the way that I need them. EUR to EUR, flag to flag, date to date. And I'll see here, this is a numeric, a string, and a date type. Data type is going to be kind of important whenever you start getting into, say, thematic mapping and bubble mapping data. Bubble mapping only works with numeric data types. Thematic mapping only works with text and date information. So depending on what you're trying to do with that data on a map, it may be better for it to be numeric, it may be better for it to be text or date information. So it just depends on what you're trying to do with it. But just be aware of that. Primarily, it just comes up with thematic and bubble mapping there. Okay, so EUR, flag, date, all that is mapped out and good to go. And we're going to go ahead and import that data. I guess the other thing to note is just what the delimiter is. This is comma delimited file. If I import any null information along with that. And we'll go ahead and import that. And so whenever you run those imports of that data, you may get a log file. We'll go ahead and click yes to see what that is. And primarily the log error you'll run into is if a well doesn't exist in the project. So this is basically just telling me that there is no well ID in my project specifically called well ID. So that's fine. I don't expect there to be. That's because I highlighted that first row of data and told it to import well ID, which there is no well ID. Then everything else after that, the actual well ID, then the zones and the attributes associated with those zones. If it looks something like this with the well ID information, zone name attribute, zone name attribute, zone name attribute, that means it's successfully imported. So you're really only running the errors when it looks something like this. Okay, but that log file can be used to kind of identify why certain wells didn't import. You can kind of pull that up and then go and look at those wells and figure out why some of that didn't import. So now I've got that in here, date, flag, and EUR values imported in directly from my spreadsheets. Those attributes are now in there within the particular zone, and their data is in there. So a couple of these were left blank. They were left blank in the spreadsheet. So it goes through there and automatically, oops, I accidentally clicked in there and it populated data. I didn't want that. So that data knows to skip over the blank information and not bring anything in there from your spreadsheet whenever you import that information. Okay. So I got that data imported. So that's kind of one of the first ways you'll bring data directly into Zone Managers. You've got a spreadsheet of some information. I want to associate that to a well. Zone Manager is the place to do that. You can also do that through like spreadsheet imports directly into well-base, but Zone Manager is kind of acting as that supplementary database. I don't have a place to put some of these values within well-base. There's no field or table for it. So Zone Manager is the place to put that. It's all user-defined, user-created. So you can kind of set this information up to be however you want it to look, how you want that data to be, whatever attributes you want to put in there. It's all up to the user. Everything's user defined. Okay. So yeah, just bringing that data directly in from that spreadsheet into Zone Manager. Pretty simple to do. Just map out what attribute it's going to, create those attributes as needed, and then populate that data there within the Zone Manager. Next, we're going to look at a couple other ways that data gets brought in. I'm going to start by looking at that cross section we looked at before. One of the things I can do within here is interval picking. So if I want to create an interval and then kind of pick that over a particular zone and then save that data into an attribute, I can do that here from within cross section. I can do that within the geomodeling cross section, and I can also do that from within Petrophysics. I'm just going to be doing it here from X section. Pretty easy for me to identify kind of multiple wells at once as opposed to Petrophysics where I'm primarily looking at kind of one at a time here. The main thing I want to be looking at is within this F11, I want to pick out some net sand thicknesses. So if I zoom in here and look at these wells, kind of between that F11 and F11 base, with this particular template that I'm using, I can see where these F11 sand pockets are within there. So I'm going to figure out how thick are each of these net sands within these wells and save that as an attribute, so I can then map that. So first, when I pick an interval, I need to create the interval to store that data. So I'm going to say a new interval type. I'm going to call this F11 sand. And then I'll go into my drop-down box, and there's my F11 sand. I'll give that a color here to say orange. And I'm going to go through here now, and I can pick that in each of these wells. So I'm going to look here, and so I'm just going to pick this over the grab from the interval picking tool. Pick that over each of these sandstone pockets there. And I'm primarily just going to stay within that F11 zone. Anything picked outside of that F11 zone will not be included in my F11 calculation. So I'm only looking at data from here to here. Now, when I save this data, there is a zone in there called well zone. The well zone is primarily used kind of as a catch-all, where it's defined as absolute measured depth of 0 to TD of the well, where I can calculate my net sand thicknesses kind of over the entire length of the well. So I can save the data there in that well zone. But for this purpose, I'm primarily just looking at the F11. So I'm only going to be picking sandstone regions within there. So just making my way across some of these here. And what it's going to do is it's going to sum these. So in this case, where I have 4 feet and 29 feet, when I save this, that's going to be 32 feet of sand within this well. Sorry, 33, can't do math. And so just picking across here. Now I'm going to get towards the end of this cross section. And yeah, it doesn't need to be perfect. When I get to the end of this cross section, I'm going to see there's a couple of wells don't have a sandstone. That's fine. Not every well is going to have that. But what I do want to do is indicate in that well that there is in fact no sand with it. Because when I save this data and I come back and some of them come back null, I might think that I accidentally missed the well. When I come back and look at it and realize I did not miss the well, it is in fact that there's just no sand within there. So let me go ahead and pick all the ones that have a sand first. Yep. And then I'll come back over here to this well. So if I right-click in this well in between the F11 and the F11 base, I can indicate a 0 marker. So that way I know that this has 0 net feet of sand within that F11 zone. So when I save that, I'll have a 0 value there as opposed to a blank. That way I know, in fact, that no, that's not a well that I missed. That's just a well that doesn't have any data. And I'll put that for a couple of these other wells. And everything else should be picked. So within cross-section, I've picked all these different intervals, and I'm going to go ahead and save all this data out back into Zone Manager. So I'm going to say Save Interval Data. So save icon on that toolbar. And it's going to ask me how I want to save that. So I want to save it to Zone Manager, and I want to select which zones that I want to save that to. So I'm going to say this F11 sand interval that I've picked. Which zone is that going to be saved to? So I'm going to save that to my primary zone that I've created here. And let's save them as measured depth. So in this case, these are all vertical wells. So MD and TVD are pretty much going to be the same. So I'm just going to be calculating out MD in this case. And then go ahead and finish. So that gets calculated, put it back over into Zone Manager, and I should see F11 sand is now added into that. And so I can see the 0 markers for the wells that didn't have any sand. And a couple of these wells don't have values because I didn't have every well in that cross section. Some of these are, like I said, the ones that are missing that F11 base didn't really get picked up in that cross section. But I can see how that value got brought in and populated within here. Again, just taking those values picked at each well and then summing that over that interval and applying that value to the well there. That's kind of how cross-section is going to interact with Zone Manager data. Picking those intervals, saving that data back in here as an attribute, and then I can take that attribute and we'll look at here in just a minute, building an isomap of that information that I can then put back into GeoAtlas. So I'll jump over to Petrophysics. Petrophysics is another kind of commonly used application with Zone Manager, kind of how that gets used. And I'm just going to be looking at kind of some basic curve information within here. I want to say, across a couple of these wells, just take a gamma ray curve and average that over a given interval from one particular top to another. So from here, I'm going to go to my Interpretation tab and click on Curve Data Statistics. With Curve Data Statistics, I can kind of choose which curve I want to calculate on. In this case, we'll choose that gamma ray curve. This can be based on a depth interval, and I can assign the top and base here, or because I've already built the zone here in Zone Manager, I can select that and it automatically fills that out with F11 to F11 base there for me. And I'm just calculating out an average, the gamma ray average over that interval, and then we'll add that in there. And if I want to do other things like sum a curve over an interval, or figure out where it's greater than or less than a particular constant and kind of sum over that, I could do that as well and say anywhere that my gamma ray curve is greater than a value of 45 or something like that. Over that same interval, I can calculate that as well. And I can keep pulling in different curves and different statistic calculations over these intervals. So given whatever curve data you have there for that particular project, or whenever curves are calculated from your UDEs, you choose any of that information to then bring that into here, depending on which UDE is active there. Okay, so I'm going to just calculate these two parameters, calculating this all as measured depth. Now I'm just going to calculate that across all 21 wells that I have here. Some of these are going to come back null. That's fine there. Other thing to kind of quickly note is I kind of mentioned before, whenever I'm calculating F11 to F11 base, some of those wells didn't have an F11 base. So in that case, let's just use the next available base or stop depth. And so what that means is I'll look for F11 base. If that doesn't exist, go down to the next formation down stratigraphically. So in this case, it's going to be my F39. And then I keep working its way down until it finds a pick in that well, or it just goes to the stop depth of the curve data. So you can kind of tell it to use that information if you're missing a base pick, depending on your zone definition there. So we'll go ahead and use that, just calculate across all wells. And we'll create that data. And so in some of these places, for instance, these first 5 wells don't have a gamma ray in them, so that's why those are coming back null. Then I come in here and see my gamma ray averages, and then my kind of summed gamma ray where it's greater than the 45 value I put in there. So I kind of figure out, do these values look reasonable? Do I need to go back and look at any of these wells and figure out why it's giving me the values that it's giving me? Otherwise, I can look at that and say, yep, that all looks reasonable. Let's go ahead and save this out to Zone Manager. So typically I'll save these values out to Zone Manager as opposed to just building a map directly from them. Because once they're in Zone Manager, I can do other things with them. There's a zones calculator I can do in there where I can add various attributes together. I could even post these values on a well-based layer, so I can actually see the value as opposed to just as the data point itself. And just having it in there in Zone Managers, like I said, a bit more flexibility I have with the value if I need to come back to it at a certain point. So again, if I need to create an attribute for it, I can see if I already have one. And if I don't, then I can go ahead and create one. So we'll say new attribute. And this is going to be my average gamma ray units there. And then the specific domain that it might be pertaining to, and then whether it's numeric type data or not. So we'll say it's numeric. Say 3 decimal places is fine. Click OK. And I want to go ahead and save these zone and attribute names. And so what this is going to do is going to make sure that it's going to create the zone if it's not already created. I can create a new zone from scratch here if I need to. And it's going to create the attribute for me as well. So say save zone and attribute names. But I don't want to save the data yet because I want to set up the second one. So this is going to be my gamma ray greater than 45. So we'll say a new attribute. And we'll say gamma ray greater than 45 API numeric. This brings up a good point here. There's certain characters that you'll want to avoid when creating attribute and zone names. And those are going to be typically things like the greater than sign, percent signs, asterisks, slashes. I guess no, it can still contain slashes. There's certain characters in there that it won't allow you to use because those are used as delimiters in the back end of the SQL database. So if you ever run across that, you'll see a message like this. It's just going to indicate that, sorry, you can't use that particular character when creating attribute names or anything else like that. So I can just say gamma ray greater than 45 or something like that, or whatever you want to kind of do to indicate what it's supposed to be there. I can kind of look at that and just know what that means, or I can put a little description there. Here I should be able to put the greater than sign there, indicating what that's going to mean. Save zone and attribute names, and now I can save that to Zone Manager. Okay, so I can switch back over to Zone Manager, and there are those values. Okay. So curve data statistics, a couple different kind of calculations I can get from curve values over a particular interval. The other one you'll typically see a lot is your reservoir pay summations. So given reservoir pay summations where I had these input curves, water sat, porosity, and shale volumes, I can calculate out specific information within here, like gross interval, gross reservoir, net res, net pay, fee pay, water sat pay, v shale pay, v res, v shale res. All these different kind of calculations I can do given these input curves and then over a particular zone. So it's my F11 primary zone. I can calculate out my gross interval, reservoir, net res, and net pay here, all in measured depth in that zone. And then the same kind of options I saw before. If the zone base is missing, use either the next available formation or the stop depth, whichever one I come across first. If any of these reservoir thicknesses are less than a particular value, I can ignore those. But primarily here, I'm just more worried about the zone itself. So I'm going to calculate these four things over that interval and go ahead and compute that data. And then I can see all the information that I get in there, depending on where the top or the base might be picked. So like this gross interval, I can see this one's a bit larger, so it probably didn't find an F11 base, but it went down a bit deeper to the TD or to the stop depth of the curve information. But mainly just kind of going through here and checking, again, do values make sense? Does all of this seem reasonable to me? If it checks out, I can then save this back into Zone Manager as well. So in this case, the attribute name is going to match what the calculation name is, but I can change that name here before I actually save that. Whenever you're ready to save those attributes, this is the attribute name that it's going to create. So you can kind of rename those before you actually save it into Zone Manager. Which I didn't rename it before it went in there, so I'll just have the default names, but I can come back in here and change those and re-import it and go in there and delete the other ones if I don't want those. So again, go back over to Zone Manager, and I should see the gross int, gross res, and net pay. Okay, so let's bring in a lot of that petrophysical information directly here into Zone Manager. Let's say I've gotten all these values and I'm kind of bringing this in from my spreadsheets. I'm calculating it from my interval picking there within cross section. I brought in some petrophysical values. Now I want to kind of get an idea of what did this data look like on a map. So we'll go over to GeoAtlas and I'm gonna go close my cross section here. So I don't hit that crazy line there. And I want to go ahead and map some of this data here now. So we'll go over and do a couple things. First, let's look at, if I want to say color code these wells based on that flag that I brought in there, I can do that through, like I said, thematic mapping on a well base layer. So I'm going to update this well base layer first, as I need to populate it with the zone attribute information. I'm going to say zone, attribute value, and I can either post the value or just add it to the map tip bin. If it's in the map tip bin, I can still use it for thematic posting without it actually posting a value itself on the map, or I can actually have the value appear there. So I need to choose the zone that I want to pull that data from, the F11 primary zone. The attribute name, in this case, is going to be the flag attribute. And then say finish. Kind of position where I want that to go. I can change how that's going to post some information. Make that just a little bit bigger. Make that a red value so it stands out. And we'll click OK. So that's going to build the layer there, and I can probably just move that over a little bit more, closer to the well spot there. So now each well has its zone identifier, A, B, C, or D. Like, so they don't really mean anything. There's just some number or letters I put in there. Now I want to color code these wells based on that information. So using your thematic mapper, because it's text data, I can do that. So we'll come in here to attribute flag. And then each value here has a particular color associated to it. So A wells can be red, B wells can be green, C wells yellow, D wells blue, and I can associate them to a square, a circle, whatever kind of symbol I want to put in there. And it helps if I actually turn it on. And so you can kind of go through there and thematically map that information. So again, any text or date attribute, I can kind of make those maps and color code wells based on that information. So it's pretty useful for a lot of times, like if you're trying to figure out the formation that hits at TD or any kind of a horizontal, whatever its target zone is or anything else like that. You can bring that in as an attribute and then color code it that way. Okay, just go ahead and turn that off there. So yeah, thematic mapping, I can kind of bring in those text attributes to do that. Another part is going to be your numeric attributes. I want to actually build a contour map to indicate what that might be doing. So let's build that net sand map that I built from that F11 zone. So we're going to come up here to contour and then isomap build surface. It's like any other contour map that you build, you're going to choose a data source for that information. So you say add, and then where that data is going to come from. So zone manager data has its own option here. Data source is zone manager. And click OK. And it's going to prompt me for the zone and attribute that I want to pull that data from. So there's my primary zone. The attribute can be any of those attributes that I've associated to that zone. We'll take that F11 sand that I picked out of the cross section. And if I want to filter that out, I can pull up any well-based filter that I might have. And that goes through and it gets me my data distribution here. 15 wells have data ranging from 0 to 32. Look at that and see if that all seems reasonable. So this is the point where if you hadn't calculated out XYZ data in Zone Manager to begin with, then this would come back with null data saying I can't find any data points. It has to have that XYZ to know where to put the point. Okay, and this is my, I'll say F11 sand thickness. I'm not going to spend too much time with the gridding algorithm stuff. We'll say contours ranging from 0 to 33. I can do 1 foot interval. I can do a 5 foot interval. Bump it up to say 35. And we'll just go ahead and finish that map. Yep, I forgot to put a boundary polygon around it. 2 seconds. I'll add that boundary polygon in there just so I can kind of clip all my data to where I actually have my data points, as outside of this there's a bunch of blank space that doesn't have any data points that I kind of ignore. So we'll keep everything in here where the data points actually exist. And so that I can get that contour map to kind of indicate behind that grid there, kind of what that's going to look like. And then I have all the various values associated with each of those data points there that I can post. So very simple to just go in there, and any kind of numeric attribute that I have, you're building that contour map off of that by adding in that data source from Zone Manager to incorporate and build a map off of that. So just which zone is it coming from, and then which attribute do you want to use? I could go in there and pull up my my net pay that I had calculated from a Reservoir pay summations. Use that to build a map. So any attribute that you have in there, if it's numeric, you can build a map off of it. You can use it for bubble mapping. Anything else that you kind of do with the numeric values within there. Okay. All right, so that should kind of take us to the end there, kind of the basics of working with Zone Manager. Main thing you're going to be looking at in there is, building out the zone. What area are you focusing on? What interval are you focusing on within that zone? Where does that top and base define? Where does it kind of pick up and show? And then calculate these particular attributes within there. I said from there, it's kind of then just getting the data populated and then mapping that on your map there within GeoAtlas. Various other things you can kind of do with that data within Zone Manager. Like I mentioned before, you can do some attribute calculations or anything else like that, or I can say take an attribute calculator and take these attributes that I've generated in here and run some sort of calculation with another attribute. Like if I just want to add two attributes together, you can do like an A plus B, and then just define what A and B are there. So, my gross interval plus my gross reservoir, if I wanted to add those two together, kind of just go in there and pull that data together to calculate that. So you can run any kind of calculations you want in there. You want to take an attribute, divide it by a number, take two attributes and average them over each other. Kind of figure out a net thickness or something like that. And I can take those two attributes and then subtract them from each other. So a lot of different kind of plugins you can do for that calculation. Basically, that'll then generate a new attribute and then give you another column in there for that information with the value associated to it. Okay. But yeah, kind of some of the basics of working with Zone Manager there. Hope you guys got some useful information out from that.